So separating out process evaluation criteria, handoffs, and incentives, wanted to separate this out and just set the context for this because it really is going to depend on your specific situation. The most important thing to take out of this is understanding your stakeholders. So breaking down the different ones, the first three are pretty self-explanatory. You have the person that's submitting the idea. You have initial evaluators who are going to be responsible for shortlisting and routing ideas. And then you have approvers who are the very specific definition here. They're budget owners who have the ability to approve or disapprove the idea, and they own the resources in order to implement the idea. But then things get a little bit more nuanced. So when you think of implementation, we like to separate that out between people who are responsible for validating and then integrating the idea into operation. So validators would be doing like a pilot test or proving the value of the idea on a short-term or smaller basis. And then the integrators are typically the business unit who the idea ultimately that is validated is handed off to integrate into the actual business unit. And where we really see a lot of the problems arise is when we have a dichotomy, not a dichotomy, but a differential between these three groups. So oftentimes, especially when you're doing one-time annual events, if you have a executive involved in approving the idea being approved might not actually have resources from that executive around validation and integration, or there might be a different reporting structure. So oftentimes, people that are validating or integrating are not going to be incentivized to do so. Looking at like how many steps your process should have, and we're going to go right back into understanding how to kind of self-check when you're setting up your process to make sure that you don't run into the issue where you have a differential between these three groups. But just to go into how many steps your process should have, this really is going to be dependent upon your program goals and number of people that you're engaging. But this is just a nice rule of thumb, and it's a nice visual that you can present. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. So up front, you have crowdsourcing or collection of ideas. The crowdsource component of that, you can have people voting and commenting and collaborating around ideas if you're using a dedicated tool or something like Microsoft Teams. If you're using Microsoft Forms, that's just going to be a collection step. Then you'll have a period where you're routing to owners for initial approval, evaluating and prioritizing because you're going to receive a lot more ideas than you can actually implement. Then from there, you have implementation and recognition and reporting on outcomes. That implement and recognize step breaks out both the initial testing as well as the integration. In order to design your evaluation criteria, what we want to do is ensure that your criteria tie back to the organizational goals that you set at the beginning of the program. Once again, that's making sure that you have alignment between the business unit who's going to be integrating it, along with the company goals and your innovation team goals if possible. This would just be for the first round. Obviously, over time, you want to make sure the goals of your innovation team are going to be in alignment so that you continue getting funding yourself. Just to kickstart things a lot of the time, though, you are going to want to focus on ideas that are going to be easy to implement and have a high potential to impact customer experience or whatever metric that business unit who's sponsoring your challenge is being measured on. Then from there, you'll quickly be able to build good relationships and partnerships and start to break down that barrier where you have that disincentive naturally from your goals as an innovation team and the business unit goals for hitting those KPIs every quarter or every year. Last piece, we've seen a lot at this point. We highly suggest keeping it simple. Same with the process, really the overall governance, especially when getting started. There's no point in building a lot of bureaucracy into the process. We suggest keeping evaluation criteria minimum of 3, maximum of 10. Normally 4 to 5 metrics is 4 to 5 evaluation metrics is going to be the best to go with. And we have several examples depending on your specific program that we can share after the webinar. Going into handoffs, validation, and implementation, like I said, we were going to come back to the stakeholders and understanding those different stakeholders. Once again, we want to make sure that we have alignment between approvers, validators, and integrators. What that means is that the person, if there is a differential between the approver, the validator, and the integrator, you want to make sure that all 3 of those parties are present when we go into our evaluation. So point number 1 here, once again, ensuring that your evaluation criteria tie back to the goals. You want to make sure that you have all three of these individuals' goals set when you're doing the evaluation, and that all three of them are bought in to the ideas that are ultimately selected for testing and implementation. Regarding incentivizing participation, this is specifically for employees. There's another side of this for managers, mid-level management in the company, but we actually included this in our survey. And one interesting thing that we found was we asked what incentivized people to participate in these programs, but also if they had the opportunity to implement their idea, even if it meant working more time for the same amount of pay. 65% of respondents said that they agreed, and if they were given the opportunity, they would take ownership of their idea and help implement it, even if it meant working extra hours. On the right side here, we can see some prizes and incentive examples that we've seen work. Amazon Echo Dots are a very, very common option, but you also have non-monetary prizes, which work really well. And then going into those 2 pro tips, right, you have involving idea submitters in testing and validation. And then ultimately, right, when you get this program really up and running and prove the value of it, the way to solidify it and really bake it into the culture is getting participation into employee performance reviews. There's no way you're going to be able to do that in the short term when you initially launch the program. Once again, it's something to aspire to over time and to keep in mind as you start to build on initial success within the program.